"Hands up! Don't move!" Officer Callahan shouted, his gun trained on the young girl standing frozen in front of him. "I'm not doing anything. I'm just walking home." Her voice trembled, her hands raised in surrender, her eyes wide with fear. But it was too late. 2 shots rang out. A scream cut through the air as the girl crumpled to the ground, her life draining away in the same street where she had walked every day for years. Her name was Aaliyah Matthews, just 17 years old. A college-bound student with a full scholarship, her whole life ahead of her. She was only trying to catch the bus after school, but none of that mattered when Officer Callahan saw her dark skin, and feared for his life. The body cam footage showed her backing away, palms open, clearly unarmed, no threat, just a frightened teenager trying to escape the scene. But the district attorney claimed there wasn't enough evidence to charge Callahan. They called it a misunderstanding, said he was just doing his job, and expected everyone to move on. But one man didn't. Darnell, a retired soldier. Aaliyah's grandfather had a different idea. Quiet, reserved, he had spent years raising his family, shielding them from the world's cruelty. But no amount of peace could calm the storm that raged inside him now. When the system failed to bring justice, Darnell did something it could never have predicted. This is the true story of a man who had already lost everything, but was willing to do whatever it took to make sure no one else had to bury their loved ones the way he had to bury his granddaughter. The late afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Darnell hummed softly as he poured a cup of tea, glancing over at the small calendar on the fridge, which was filled with the scribbles of school events, birthdays, and reminders. His granddaughter, Aaliyah, sat at the counter, her sketchbook open, pencil dancing across the page as she tried to capture the sunlight falling on the empty coffee mug in front of her. Darnell smiled, the familiar warmth of pride swelling in his chest. She was talented, driven, and full of life every bit, the bright young woman he remembered as a little girl holding his hand at the park, asking endless questions about the world. Her laugh echoed through the small apartment, soft yet vibrant, filling the space with a sense of normalcy he cherished. He had raised his daughter, and now, in his later years, was determined to watch Aaliyah thrive, to shield her from the cruelty of a world that had already demanded too much. Darnell sat at the kitchen table, his hands still trembling as they cradled the warm cup of tea, now long cold. The world outside his window blurred, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the emptiness at his side, the space where his granddaughter used to sit. He tried to focus on the simple task of finishing his tea, but each time his gaze lifted from the mug, he saw her empty chair, her book bag still by the door, her phone lying on the counter. He had been a soldier for decades, had seen things most people could never fathom, but nothing could prepare him for the loss of his granddaughter, Aaliyah. His heart was heavy, as though it were physically broken in half, like someone had taken an iron fist and twisted it inside his chest. She had been everything to him, his joy, his future, the hope that after everything he had gone through, there was something good left in the world. And now she was gone, stolen in a single moment of violence. For years, Darnell had built a life of quiet determination. He was a retired army sergeant, the kind of man who had lived through conflict, seen the horrors of war, and returned home to give his family the peace he had never known. It wasn't easy, being away from his own children, serving his country, those were the sacrifices he had made. But nothing was harder than watching the world fail his granddaughter, the one person who had made him feel like his sacrifices meant something. Aaliyah had been different. She was smart, driven, and full of potential. She had a heart bigger than most adults, and she used it to carry the weight of her future. At just 17, she was on the verge of graduating with honors from a prestigious engineering program. She was going to change the world, to build something that would outlast them all. The whole family had been so proud of her, and Darnell had spent countless weekends with her, talking about the future. They had spent hours together, reminiscing about when she was just a little girl, sitting on his lap while he read her bedtime stories, a time when the world seemed so much simpler. Back then, there had been no fear, no looming threat of loss. He had been her protector, and she had been his joy. Now, that joy had been violently ripped away, leaving a deep, jagged scar in its place. Officer Thomas Callahan, the man who had taken Aaliyah's life, was not the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. On the surface, he was a solid, respected officer, a man who had climbed the ranks of the police force with apparent dedication. But beneath the surface, there was more. Callahan was a man who had spent years hiding his own biases, pretending to live in a world where his authority went unquestioned. He prided himself on being in control, on following the rules, on maintaining an image of integrity. But deep down, his sense of control had always been fragile, held together by the badge he wore. Officer Callahan had spent his life fighting an internal battle against the weight of fear. He was a man whose personal demons had manifested into a deep mistrust of anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of normal. The world around him made him anxious, and the power he held as badge, his gun, gave him a sense of false security, a way to keep the chaos at bay. Callahan had never been one to show emotion, to let his guard down. But on the night of the incident, something shifted inside him. Aaliyah's innocent appearance, her youthful energy, became a trigger for his own internal fears, amplified by the tensions of a world that demanded so much from him. He had seen too many faces like hers, faces that he felt uncertain about, faces that made him nervous. That panic was enough to cloud his judgment, to distort the situation, until he saw only what his mind wanted to see: a threat. When he fired his weapon, it wasn't because he had a clear reason. It was because he reacted, instinctively, out of fear. He wasn't thinking of Aaliyah, or the potential she carried, or her innocence. All he saw was a young black girl with a look in her eyes he couldn't read, and it made him feel vulnerable. Vulnerability was something Officer Callahan had never been trained to handle, especially in a society that painted the lines of authority so clearly in his favor. But when the bullet left his gun, he saw something different in the aftermath. The confusion in his mind was replaced with a sharp realization that he had just taken a life, a young life full of promise. The weight of that realization crushed him, but it didn't stop him. It didn't change the way he viewed the world or himself. He justified his actions, telling himself it had been necessary, telling himself he had been afraid for his own safety. And as the public outrage began to swell, as the calls for justice rose louder and louder, Officer Callahan remained entrenched in his self-made narrative. He was convinced he had done the right thing. He had followed his instincts. He had done his job. The truth, however, was hidden behind layers of denial, a defense that allowed him to continue living with the badge he wore, untouched by the consequences of his actions. Victor sat in the dimly lit kitchen, staring at the calendar again, trying to make sense of the pain that would not cease. He had been a man of action, a protector, but nothing prepared him for the reality that had shattered his world. The anger that simmered in his chest was not one of instant rage. It was calculated, controlled, like a simmering heat that slowly burned away all the doubt he had once carried about seeking justice. The injustice of his granddaughter's death was a spark that lit a fire within him, one that would not go out. Darnell Fisher had spent his life serving others, but now he would find a new purpose, one fueled by the desire for revenge. His grief would become his strength. Days turned into weeks, and still no justice had been served. Darnell's grief was compounded by an unshakable frustration that grew like a cancer inside him, feeding off the slow-moving wheels of the justice system. Officer Callahan's report claimed self-defense. He said Aaliyah had made a sudden movement, that she had reached for something, though there was nothing in her hands. Darnell knew the truth. He had watched the footage over and over, the body cam footage that contradicted everything Callahan claimed. His granddaughter had been standing still, her hands raised in surrender, her body language pleading for peace. There had been no sudden movement, no threat. Just a frightened girl and an officer who had acted on fear, not reason. But the report, the investigation, the entire process seemed to move at a crawl. The police department, in its usual fashion, backed its own officer, citing Callahan's clean record and the absence of clear evidence to charge him. They claimed the footage wasn't conclusive enough, even though the public saw the same thing. Darnell saw a frightened young woman who hadn't had a chance to live. Callahan, despite having killed Aaliyah, was still on active duty, placed on paid administrative leave while the investigation proceeded. As each day passed without charges, Darnell's resolve grew colder. The family was forced to wait, to watch as the world around them moved on. Each time Darnell looked at the television, he saw the same clips of Callahan speaking, a man who appeared calm and confident, yet was clearly hiding behind a wall of excuses. The news reports were flooded with interviews from his fellow officers, painting a picture of the officer as an exemplary man, a hero even. The people who should have been calling for justice were instead praising the same man who had taken Aaliyah's life. It felt like a slap in the face. The public outrage began to swell. Protests erupted in the streets. Signs demanding justice for Aaliyah Matthews filled the town square. Darnell watched the news every night, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He saw the placards with his granddaughter's face on them, heard the chants of "No justice, no peace," but all he could feel was emptiness. The system had failed him, and it wasn't just a legal failure. It was a moral one, too. The body cam footage, the one piece of evidence that could provide clarity, was suddenly released to the public, but it was no longer the unaltered truth it should have been. The images were jittery, distorted, and fragmented. There were sudden cuts in the footage, moments that should have shown exactly what happened, but had been inexplicably missing. No explanation was offered. No apology. It was as if the very institution that was supposed to uphold justice had decided that some truths were too dangerous to reveal. Darnell watched the footage again, his fists clenched. His granddaughter's final moments, the horror, the disbelief on her face as the bullet tore through her, were reduced to a glitchy, incomplete mess of images. He could barely make out her figure, let alone the details that would have shown her innocence. The more he stared, the more his frustration burned, his mind searching for answers that weren't there. He could hear Aaliyah's voice in his head, could see her laughter like it was just yesterday. But now all he had was an image of her body lying cold in the snow, her life snuffed out by a system that was more concerned with protecting its own than seeking truth. The system had failed. That thought echoed in Darnell's mind, louder with each passing day. The justice he had hoped for was slipping further out of reach, and every attempt to hold Callahan accountable seemed like a cruel joke. On the third week after Aaliyah's death, the district attorney's office made an announcement. Darnell had already heard whispers they were going to clear Officer Callahan. The DA stood at the podium, a cold expression on her face as she read from a prepared statement. The words felt like poison in Darnell's ears. "There is insufficient evidence to prove criminal intent," she said. The world around him blurred as Darnell's breath caught in his throat. There was nothing to prove? A video, a body, the weapon, but no evidence? His granddaughter had been murdered in cold blood, and they were telling him there wasn't enough evidence to charge the officer. His knees went weak, and he slumped into the chair beside him. Aaliyah's face floated before him, but it was only a memory, now fading faster than he could hold on to it. He had been waiting for this moment, the one where justice would be served, where he could tell his daughter, her mother, that it would all be okay. But that moment never came. Instead, the prosecutor's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, muffling everything around him. No indictment. No trial. No justice. People in the room began to shift, murmuring in disbelief, but Darnell didn't hear them. The press had already begun to report on the verdict, and the streets were flooded with people, their signs raised in the air, shouting for answers. But for Darnell, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The only thing he knew for sure was that no one would answer for Aaliyah's death. His mind began to turn, slowly at first, but with each passing day, it grew more focused, more calculated. He began to think in ways he had never considered before, using the skills he had learned as a soldier, the precision, the calm under pressure. Darnell was no longer just mourning the loss of his granddaughter. He was planning something much bigger, something the system couldn't ignore. In the weeks following the district attorney's announcement, Darnell's grief began to harden into something else, something far colder. The fire that had once burned bright in his chest, one that drove him to be a good man, a father, a protector, slowly dimmed. It was replaced by a quiet, consuming rage that took root deep in his bones. He stopped attending family gatherings, ignored calls from his daughter, and stopped showing up to his job at the auto shop. The world outside seemed irrelevant now. A pale reflection of the world that had once made sense. Darnell didn't hate his family, didn't want to hurt them. He just knew that what he was about to do, what he was becoming, would shatter everything. There was no place for Aaliyah in the world anymore, and now he had to face the uncomfortable truth that the only way he could live with her death was through vengeance. It was the only thing that could offer him any sense of peace, and for that peace, he was willing to sacrifice everything. He spent hours locked in his small study, the blinds drawn tight, the air thick with the smell of old leather-bound books and the fading scent of his granddaughter's perfume that still lingered in the room. The walls, once adorned with family photos, were now bare, except for one framed picture, Aaliyah's high school graduation photo. Her radiant smile seemed to mock him, the joy frozen in time, unreachable. Darnell had always prided himself on his methodical nature, his ability to focus. His years in the military had taught him that chaos could be tamed, that patience was more powerful than brute force. But the man he was becoming now was different. There were no more distractions, no more comfort in the mundane. The plan had taken root in his mind, and there was nothing that could stop it. He began his work in silence, compiling everything he could find about Officer Thomas Callahan. He researched his background, his military service, his promotions, his family, the daily routine that Callahan kept so tightly to. The more he learned, the more it became clear to Darnell that Callahan's life was a carefully crafted facade, one that barely covered the cracks. He wasn't the hero the media had made him out to be. He was a man hiding behind his badge, clinging to the power he held, unable to cope with the reality of what he had done. The more Darnell uncovered, the more his determination solidified. Callahan had to pay not just for the death of Aaliyah, but for the way he had so easily dismissed her life, her promise, her potential. The officer had taken the future of a young woman who was going to change the world, and for what? Fear? Bias? A fleeting moment of panic? Darnell's mind turned. With deadly precision. His military training kicked in, and he approached this task with the same focus he had once brought to the battlefield. Every detail mattered. Every movement, every choice, every misstep Callahan had made would be his undoing. Darnell didn't make mistakes. He couldn't afford to. His granddaughter's memory demanded that he succeed. He started with the basics: Callahan's home. He studied Google Maps, scoured public records for information on the officer's residence. He learned the layout of the street, the distance to the nearest patrol station, and the time it took for Callahan to drive from his home to work. Darnell built a map, not just of the house, but of the man. Every time Callahan left for work, every moment his family was gone, every route he took, Darnell kept meticulous notes. Next came Callahan's routines, his hours at the precinct, his downtime at home, and his family's schedule. Darnell learned the names of his children, the school they attended, the places they visited on weekends. He memorized the details, becoming almost invisible in his pursuit of the man who had ruined his life. Nothing was left to chance. Every evening after work, Darnell would sit in his study, the lights low, scribbling notes on the edges of his maps, marking the exact moments when he could strike, when Callahan would be most vulnerable. He practiced timing, not just when to strike, but when to disappear into the shadows. It was all about precision. Darnell had been taught that one wrong move, one moment of hesitation, could cost him everything. Days turned into weeks as he perfected his plan. He set the pieces into motion, slowly calculating, waiting for the right moment. The public protests had become a constant backdrop to his actions, the chants and signs almost like white noise in the back of his mind. But each protest, each wave of anger and grief, only fueled his drive. The justice they demanded would not be delivered in a courtroom. It would be delivered by him. He watched Callahan's movements, following him from a distance on the days when the officer was off duty. He watched the way Callahan interacted with his family, the way his wife always kissed him goodbye in the morning, and how he would stand at the window watching her leave. He watched the children play in the yard, oblivious to the darkness that had already begun to seep into their lives. Darnell made no move to confront Callahan. Not yet. Every day he measured his progress, ensuring that each action he took was just one step closer to his goal. His hands trembled sometimes, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was becoming. He had spent his life serving others, protecting the ones he loved. But now, his purpose had shifted. As the day of reckoning drew closer, Darnell's transformation was complete. The man who had once been content to live a quiet, honorable life had become someone else, someone colder, someone who would no longer ask for justice. Instead, he would take it. His first step was the hardest. He knew what he was about to do would ruin everything. It would tear his family apart, destroy the life he had built for so long. But he no longer cared. Aaliyah was gone, and the justice that he had once believed in had failed him. It was time to deliver a new kind of justice, one that was not bound by the rules, one that had no place for mercy or remorse. And as the day finally arrived, Darnell set the final piece of his plan into motion, the calculated precision of his actions unfolding with quiet resolve. There was no turning back now. The night had come. The final moment Darnell had spent weeks preparing for, meticulously planning, was upon him. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the shadows in his living room seemed to close in around him. His eyes were wide, but not from fear. There was nothing left in him but cold resolve. Aaliyah's face flashed briefly in his mind, but it was the anger that burned brighter now, fueling him with the strength he needed. Darnell stood in the alley behind Officer Thomas Callahan's home, watching as the lights inside flickered. His careful calculations had paid off. Callahan's wife and children were away, leaving the officer alone in his house. A perfect moment for the confrontation. That had been building for months. Darnell's hands were steady. He wasn't rushing, wasn't panicked. This was the culmination of every sleepless night, every moment spent watching and planning. He checked the weapon at his side, an old piece from his military days, now loaded and ready. The weight of it felt strangely comforting, as though it was an extension of himself. He had already mapped out the house, memorized the layout. Nothing would go wrong. He was prepared. He stepped forward, the crunch of his boots against the gravel, the only sound in the night. The house was eerily quiet, and for a moment, Darnell hesitated. His eyes drifted to the window where Callahan was sitting, the officers. Back to the world, his presence calm, unaware. The sight of Callahan, so self-assured, so comfortably unaware of the reckoning about to unfold, was almost infuriating. Darnell's breath quickened for a moment, but then he silenced it. Focus. He moved swiftly but quietly to the back door. He had expected resistance, but none came. The door was unlocked. He let out a slow breath, allowing the stillness to sink into him as he entered the house. Callahan was in the living room, the television playing low in the background. Darnell stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the man who had killed his granddaughter. The officer didn't see him at first. Callahan's eyes were fixed on the screen, his posture relaxed, his legs stretched out before him. He had no idea that Darnell, the man whose life he had destroyed, was now standing behind him, ready to exact a price. Officer Callahan. Darnell's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Callahan's head snapped around, his face going pale as he recognized the figure standing in the doorway. His hand instinctively moved toward his side, where his service weapon should have been, but Darnell was already too close. "No, don't bother," Darnell said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not here to fight you, officer. I'm here for something else." Callahan's breath caught. He seemed unsure whether to rise to his feet or to remain seated, as though trying to gauge if this was some bad dream he could shake off. His hand still hovered near the table, eyes darting nervously, as if calculating his options. "What do you want?" Callahan asked, his voice wavering. The confidence was gone now. In its place was a growing fear, an emotion Darnell hadn't seen when he had watched the officer from afar, hiding behind the illusion of control. "I want you to understand what you've done," Darnell said, stepping closer. "I want you to understand that you didn't just kill Aaliyah. You killed a future that could have been full of brilliance, of life. And all because you were too afraid of a young girl who never had a chance to hurt you. Because you decided that her life didn't matter as much as your fear." Callahan stood up suddenly, his hands raised defensively. "This is crazy. I didn't mean to do it. It was a mistake." She moved, and I reacted. I had to protect myself. I did what I thought was right. His voice cracked, panic rising in his chest as he stumbled over his own words. Darnell's eyes narrowed. His anger burned, but he remained calm. He wasn't going to let the officer get away with this. Not again. You think I'm supposed to believe that? That you just panicked and shot an unarmed girl in cold blood? You think that's an excuse? Darnell's voice was sharp now, his words cutting through the air like a blade. You made a decision. You saw her Aaliyah, and you decided she was a threat. You decided her life didn't matter. But you didn't just take her life, Callahan. You took everything she could have been. You took my future, my family's future, and you walked away scot-free. The officer's expression shifted then. Fear, yes, but also a hint of guilt. Callahan opened his mouth to say something, a justification, a defense, another excuse, but Darnell was done listening. You don't get to explain this away. You don't get to walk away from this. You took a life, Callahan. And I'm here to make you face it. Darnell's voice was cold now, distant, as though he was speaking from a place far removed from emotion. But inside, it was a different story. Callahan seemed to collapse under the weight of those words. His face twisted with a mixture of regret, shame, and disbelief. He took a step back, his body stiff and unwilling to move. I didn't mean to. I don't know what happened. It was all so fast. Darnell stepped forward, closing the gap between them. You don't get to say that anymore. The world didn't happen to you, Callahan. You made a choice. And now, you're going to live with the consequences. The room was thick with tension, the silence hanging heavy between them. Callahan's hands shook as he tried to form words. But none came out. His eyes darted nervously around the room, looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. Darnell had closed off every exit, every chance of fleeing. There was no escape. I'm sorry, Callahan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The apology, empty and hollow, seemed to hang in the air for a moment before it disappeared like smoke in the wind. Darnell's expression remained hard, but beneath that cold exterior, a small part of him recoiled. Not because he regretted this, he didn't, but because, in that moment, he realized this wasn't about revenge anymore. It had never been about revenge. It was about forcing Callahan to see what he had done, to make him understand the gravity of his actions. And Callahan had finally broken. His bravado, his shield of authority, had crumbled under the weight of his guilt. He had been forced to reckon with the truth that Darnell had carried with him for so long. The room was silent, save for the sound of Callahan's ragged breathing. Darnell's hands were steady, but his mind raced. This had been the plan, every move calculated, every word chosen. The tension that had been building finally broke, but it didn't bring the release Darnell had expected. It wasn't just about making Callahan suffer. It was about showing him the weight of Aaliyah's death, about forcing him to live with the knowledge that no excuse, no apology would ever bring her back. The silence that followed the confrontation felt like a weight Darnell could no longer carry. He watched Officer Callahan, broken and disoriented, standing in front of him, a man who had once walked through life with the arrogance of a man untouchable, now crushed under the weight of his own guilt. Callahan's breath came in ragged gasps, as his hands trembled uncontrollably. The strength he had held on to all these years, built on a false sense of power, crumbled away. There was nothing left of the officer, who had arrogantly claimed that he was just doing his job. Nothing but a man who had killed an innocent young girl, and thought he could live with it. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. Darnell stood still, watching the officer's descent. He had done what he came here to do. Justice had been served, or so he thought. In that moment, Darnell felt no victory. There was no satisfaction in the hollowing out of the man who had taken his granddaughter's life. There was only emptiness. Darnell turned his back on Callahan, the officer too broken to follow. He didn't need to see the final moments of his life. The act of retribution was done. But as Darnell walked toward the door, his steps were slow, deliberate, as if every part of him was heavy with something he could not explain. He could feel Aaliyah's absence, the hole she had left in his heart, now magnified by the bitter taste of what he had done. There was no peace, no closure. Only the aftermath of a choice that had consumed him. Asterisk. When Darnell finally arrived home, the weight of the night's events settled over him like a shroud. His daughter, Tiana's mother, was waiting for him, her face drawn with worry. She had always known the man who raised her strong, steady, a protector. But now, as she looked at him, she saw a stranger. Her eyes filled with a mix of understanding and fear. "Dad?" she said, her voice trembling as she took a step toward him. "What did you do?" Darnell didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes, bloodshot from the long night, said everything. He could see the change in his daughter's face, the way she recoiled from him, as if she could no longer see him as the man she had known. He had crossed the line, and there was no going back. He had delivered justice, but at what cost? His granddaughter, Aaliyah, was still gone. And in her place, there was now a chasm of broken family, a fractured legacy. He had stepped away from the quiet life he once knew, drawn into the darkness of vengeance. It was no longer about Aaliyah. It was about him, a man driven to act by grief and rage, who had become something he no longer recognized. The man he had once been was lost in the chaos of his actions. "Dad," Tiana said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "What have you become?" Her words cut through him. He had become a pariah, a man no longer welcome in the life he had built. His family, the people who had once looked up to him, now feared him. Darnell could see it in their eyes. They understood his pain, but they could no longer understand the man standing in front of them. He was no longer a hero. He had been transformed by his grief into something darker, a man capable of unspeakable acts. The next few days were filled with silence. There were no words left to be spoken, no apologies that could erase what had happened. The media had moved on from the story, shifting their focus to the next tragedy, the next crisis, the next public figure whose misdeeds needed to be exposed. But Darnell was left to sit with his own demons. He could not escape them. He could not outrun the consequences of what he had done. The justice he had delivered had been swift and final, but it hadn't brought his granddaughter back. He went to her grave on the 5th day after the confrontation. He stood there alone, the wind biting through his jacket, the chill of the earth seeping into his bones. It was in that moment that the full weight of his actions hit him, and he could no longer deny the truth. Aaliyah was gone, and nothing could ever bring her back. Nothing he had done, nothing he had taken, could fill the emptiness left by her death. Darnell sank to his knees beside her grave, his hands shaking. His tears froze before they even touched the ground. In the midst of the quiet, he finally understood that revenge had never been the answer. It had never been about justice, no matter how much he had convinced himself of it. It was about the void inside him that he could not fill. It was about the pain that had consumed him, the loss of his granddaughter, and the unbearable weight of her absence. He felt like a ghost, a man who had lost everything. The world around him continued on, indifferent, but inside him, nothing had moved. His granddaughter was still gone, and he was still left with the jagged remnants of a choice that could not be undone. Darnell never spoke of that night again. He disappeared from his family's life. There were no grand gestures, no words of finality. He simply faded away, becoming a figure of myth, a man whose vengeance had turned into something mythic, something far greater than the reality of what he had done. Some said he had left town, disappeared into the mountains, never to be seen again. Others whispered about him in bars and alleyways, his name carried on the wind like a shadow, a legend of what happens when a man is driven by grief and rage. But to those who had known him, Darnell West was gone. The man who had once been full of life, full of love, was lost. And in his place was a ghost one whose name would be passed down from generation to generation as a reminder of what happens when revenge replaces healing. As for Officer Callahan, his life spiraled into chaos. The once proud cop, now stripped of his badge and his honor, became a figure of pity. His career crumbled, and his family left him. But in the end, none of that mattered. He had been a footnote in Darnell's story, and the story would live on, etched into the fabric of a fractured nation. The justice he had sought wasn't in the form of a courtroom verdict. It wasn't in the form of retribution or punishment. It was in the silence, in the absence of what had once been. Asterisk.